we have a tremendous group here, and I am deeply grateful, along with my colleagues at the Center on Global Energy Policy, led by our director, Jason Bardoff. We're deeply grateful for the work that the Canadian government has done to help organize this, and we have, to help kick this off, the Consul General from Canada in New York, John Prado. So I'll turn it over to John, and then we'll get our panel going.
Thank you, David. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is John Prado, and I'm honored to be Canada's Consul General in the greatest city in the world, New York City. And I'm here tonight for what should be an extremely important and productive discussion of Arctic resource issues. I can't think of a more relevant topic, and I can assure you it's a topic you're going to be increasingly hearing more about given the geopolitical challenges our globe faces today. Je vous souhaite tous le bienvenu. Je suis très ravi de vous voir et je suis certain que ce soir, on va discuter un sujet très important. The Consul General extends its sincere thanks to our partners here at Columbia University, the Center on Global Energy, for their efforts towards tonight's event. Friends, no two countries have the relationship that Canada and the United States have. If the role of the state is to provide security and prosperity to its people, then no two countries in the history of the world have provided so much prosperity and security to each other as Canada and the United States. We have the largest trading relationship in the world. In fact, when you think about it, step back, Canada buys more goods from the United States, so a country of 35 million buys more goods from the United States than the whole European community. That puts it in a context. 36 states in this great country call Canada their #1 export market. Here in New York, you export more to Canada than the next two countries combined. If I'm in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, it exports more to Canada than the next 5 countries combined. So you can see that we have a significant relationship between our two countries on the economic front. And this also extends to the energy front. Energy is our largest export to the United States. We are the #1 exporter of oil to the United States, almost bigger than the next two countries combined. The #1 provider of natural gas, #1 provider of uranium, and the #1 provider of clean, renewable, non-greenhouse gas emitting hydropower. So energy is a key core part of this extensive relationship between our two countries. Our nations have been blessed with abundant natural resources, including in the Arctic. And we have long served as critical energy suppliers to each other. And on the environment, because we really cannot talk about energy without talking about the environment. The two go hand in hand. I was telling David, I speak probably 75% of my talks are on energy, and it's always energy and the other key E, which is the environment. Because, friends, man-made borders, environment does not respect man-made borders. We're all concerned about clean air, clean water, and land and our emissions. And we have shared values when it comes to the environment. As Arctic nations, Canada and the U.S. profoundly understand the impacts of climate change, including on our northern communities and peoples. We're facing these challenges and seeking out possible opportunities together as neighbors and allies, and we look to continue to provide leadership on the world stage. And this is why tonight's event is so important. From the development of oil and gas reserves, to diamond mines, to the growth of commercial fisheries, to the thriving global tourism industry, the vast economic potential of the North is being unlocked. There's much that we have to learn about the Arctic, including the true extent of available resources and how to best and sustainably develop them. There is, therefore, much we can learn from each other, and there are opportunities for deepening our partnerships as we learn to navigate the energy, the environmental, and economic realities of the North. Canada is proud to hold the chairmanship of the Arctic Council, the preeminent body for cooperation in the region, through next year. The United States will then resume the chairmanship. The Arctic Council is something very important to Canada. It was founded in Ottawa in 1996. We were the first chair. This is our second time go around. And you can recognize the importance of the Arctic to Canada when you see the appointment of our Environment Minister, the Honourable Leona Akoko, an Inuit from Nunavut, as Canada's Minister for the Arctic Council underscoring the priority that the Government of Canada places on the Arctic. The theme of Canada's 2-year chairmanship is the development for the people of the North, with a focus on responsible Arctic resource development, safe Arctic shipping, and sustainable circumpolar communities. This reflects Canada's own northern strategy and its 4 pillars. It's clear, concise. First, exercising our sovereignty. Second, promoting economic and social development. Third, protecting the environment. And fourth, devolving governance. To these ends, Canada's been pursuing a more strategic engagement with the U.S., our premier partner in the Arctic and the next Arctic Council chair. Both countries have long collaborated in the areas of science, technology, environmental protection, infrastructure development, search and rescue, border patrols, law enforcement, and surveillance. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from our speakers and to the discussion with you, energy and Arctic experts, and North America watchers with different perspectives and insights that will help advance our collective dialogue. Special thanks to our Canadian speaker, David Scott of the Canadian Polar Commission, for joining us. I'm now pleased to turn things over to our moderator, David Sandalow. Thank you.
Thanks, John, for that tremendous kickoff for this session. We're going to have 2 speakers. One, as you just heard, is David Scott, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Polar Commission. Mr. Scott has a long career with the Geologic Survey of Canada, most recently serving as the Director of the Northern Canada Division. He has a PhD in geological sciences, and his thesis research was on the tectonic origin of 2 billion-year-old oceanic crust in the Arctic, which may be off topic today, but actually I'm interested to learn a little bit more about that. He's published and presented over 80 technical papers, and he'll start, then I'll introduce our next speaker, and then we'll have a discussion. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. We're always very pleased to engage an audience that's interested about the Arctic and the various issues that pertain to the Arctic. Just as an introductory statement, I'll suggest that things that originate in the Arctic no longer stay in the Arctic. And on the reverse side of things that originate outside of the Arctic often wind up in the Arctic. So the Arctic is really not an isolated place. It's really part of a global system. So let's keep that one in mind, especially as we talk about energy and the environment. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm grateful to our colleagues at the Consulate General to bring me down here to share a little bit of Arctic expertise from a Canadian perspective. I'll start by saying a little bit about our organization, the Canadian Polar Commission. We're a small federal government agency. We're located in Ottawa, and we're basically a knowledge broker. We stay on top of knowledge that's being created in both polar regions, north and south. We're the unique federal organization that has a bipolar mandate. We try to make sense out of that information and share it. We analyze it, and then we share it around so that folks who need to know more about the Arctic can easily find information and use it for their own purposes. We're very much firm believers that knowledge should underpin all policy decisions to the extent that it can. There's always additional factors, but we want the fundamental facts to be straight and on the table. I'm not going to represent the Arctic Council. That's Foreign Affairs that does that in Canada, so I'll defer on that one. I'm also not going to talk about any specific energy projects, such as pipelines that may cross our shared border. That's the realm in Canada of our Department of Natural Resources, and really it's a discussion at the level of elected officials at this point, so I really won't talk about that. I'm also not going to talk about the polar vortex. You may have enjoyed or not some of its antics this summer, or winter rather. We don't really have anything to do with that either. So I'll just move on here. A vote of thanks to this chap, academician Artur Chilingarov, who's a Russian. He was the chap who repeated the publicity stunt of dropping something onto the ocean floor at the North Pole. A consortium led by Canadians did it about 40 years earlier to drop a sonar beacon at the North Pole, and it had 6 or 7 international flags on it. It was part of an expedition that was exploring basically the structure of the Arctic Ocean back in the old days before GPS existed and you had to do other types of navigation. So the tip of the hat this time goes around to waking up to the world to the fact that the Arctic is important. 2007, of course, was also the summer when the summer sea ice extent was at a minimum, and that started to make newspapers and people connecting dots, and it's all about climate change, and it's all downhill from here. I think that's a little bit of a simplification, but nevertheless, it really started to focus non-Arctic specialists' interest on the Arctic. And when people are paying attention, that's an excellent opportunity to be at the science policy interface, where new knowledge can start to inform decisions. Ideally, I'm a scientist at heart, and I'm now in that science policy interface, so I really believe that the best available knowledge really needs to go into decisions. See that okay? So this is a bit of an adaptation of a study that the United States Geological Survey, as part of their global mandate of things, keeping track on energy resources globally. And you can argue about the individual numbers and their estimates, but at least it's internally consistent at the scale of the planet. So it really is a definitive piece of work, and it highlighted the fact that, depending on how you size it up, about a quarter of the undiscovered hydrocarbons on the planet that theoretically should be there based on geology are in the Arctic. They are within this circle, which is cut off at about 60 degrees latitude. Geologists are pretty good at predicting volumes of oil and gas, so you can probably hang your hat on those numbers. Exploration geologists are really good at finding even more, typically. So when you start looking with the drill bit, you tend to start find a little bit more. So people are paying attention because there's a lot of it up there. The less exciting and unlikely to make the newspaper part is most of that is already within sovereign territory. Much of it is actually onshore in Russia, North Slope of Alaska, onshore in Canada, or in the 200 nautical mile economic exclusive zones of those countries. So it's big news to say it's wide open and there's lots of it, so it's going to be just a free-for-all. Well, a lot of it is actually within very clearly identified sovereign territorial ground. So it really isn't going to be a big race to get there, in my opinion, but I stand to be corrected. Suffice to say, there is a lot of it's already been discovered, much of it's already in production, and the rest, about a quarter of the world's remaining resources, are out there somewhere. They have yet to be discovered. It's a difficult place to work. It's dark all year long, not all year long, all winter long. It's light all summer long. It's fabulous. I lived at the southern tip of Baffin Island for 4 years as a geologist back at the turn of the century. It's a wonderful place to live. Harsh, remote, high risk, never easy, but there's hydrocarbons out there, and as the demand increases, supply follows. Here's a little bit about Canada itself. So if we start up in the top right-hand corner, those are our 3 northern territories. It's about 25% of the global Arctic. So a quarter of the Arctic is in Canada, territorial Canada, dry land Canada. It's about 40% of our country is up there. Huge amount of coastline, longest coastline anywhere on the planet. And that Arctic territory in Canada captures the full range of Arctic ecosystems. So the full diversity is there, from trees still growing on the western side of it there, and the tree line kind of runs diagonally across. And it's the high-end tundra, and in fact on Baffin Island on the extreme east, it's alpine Arctic tundra at 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 feet. So very, very extreme environments. The full spectrum is there. 110,000 people call that area home. It's an area the size of Western Europe, and 110,000 people live there. That's it. It's relatively underpopulated. We put Texas up there more or less to scale. So our blue Arctic overlain by Western Europe, and Texas for scale in the bottom. It's huge, and it's really not tremendously populated. The people who live there are important. They are overwhelmingly the indigenous peoples, the folks we used to call Indians and Eskimos, who we now call First Nations people and Inuit. They are the people who have been there prior to discovery of that part of the world by Europeans 500 plus years ago. There's been a long history of interactions between Europeans and indigenous peoples. And we like to think that in the current generation, the progress that we're making to share and devolve governance powers to Aboriginal peoples, the First Nations and the Inuit, are really like never before in terms of respecting Aboriginal title, respecting Aboriginal interests, and providing genuine ownership to land and underlying resources. And we're doing that through the modern land claims treaty process. So the different colored polygons on the map are the current modern land claims that, unlike previous ones where we'll take everything and reserve you a little parking lot somewhere, these are peer-to-peer, nation-to-nation agreements that give genuine title and hope and responsibilities to the Indigenous peoples. Canada has a northern strategy, and in parallel with it, we have a statement on our Arctic foreign policy, and the two are, oddly enough, really well aligned. The four main pillars, biggest efforts right now is going into the two central ones, social and economic development and environmental protection. So there again, we have the energy and environment going hand in hand. Governance on the far side, we're in the process of transferring decision-making from the central federal government based in Ottawa to the local territories so that they can take charge and ownership of resources and use those resources wisely on their own terms to advance their own social economic development. So mom and dad in Ottawa don't necessarily know best. We're devolving the responsibilities to the leaders who are from the Northern Territories. We do some additional things around sovereignty. I'll show a few images of what that goes. Interesting thing about sovereignty, if you ask Northerners, they're saying there isn't really an issue. We're here, we live here, we've always lived here. There really isn't a big deal with respect to sovereignty. That's a perspective we hear often from Northerners themselves. The good news as a scientist, science and technology underpin all four pillars. That's code for we want the best available knowledge to make the best possible policy decisions. Again, there's always additional factors beyond just the pure nuts and bolts science, but fundamentally, you want to have the facts straight before you start making too many decisions. John referenced the Arctic Council. Here's Arctic Council 101 on just one slide. The 8 Arctic states across the top and the permanent participants. These are bodies that represent the Indigenous peoples of the Arctic, and there are 6 of those bodies. There's more groups of Indigenous peoples than that, but they're clustered together under 6 permanent participants. The 8 Arctic states and the 6 permanent participants are the decision makers at the Arctic Council. Much news about a year ago when a whole bunch of non-Arctic states became official members as observers, and that's the non-Arctic states on the far side. The ongoing work of the Arctic Council gets delivered in the 6 main cross-cutting programs. So Arctic monitoring assessment, conservation of Arctic flora and fauna, sustainable development, emergency prevention, preparedness and protection, Arctic contaminants. That's the bread and butter of what the Council does. Scientific investigation, synthesis, reporting, advising the Arctic states on how regulations might be put in place locally. And increasingly, in the case of search and rescue, we're now getting into binding agreements among the Arctic countries that commit us to helping each other out and agreeing on things that transcends national borders. There's also some short-term task forces, and the newest one that Canada has introduced is on business, circumpolar economic development and the private sector in particular. So that's Arctic Council 101. That's all I'm really going to say about that. We have better experts in the room. Shameless plug for one of our new products as a knowledge broker. Rather than having a bunch of out-of-date information on the backside of our website, we've actually created an app that works really well in the iOS world on your iPad or iPhone. It also works in a mobile app, just not quite as elegantly. Polarcom.gc.ca is where you can grab it right now, and I've got a few little promotional postcards as well to help you out. It's got information on polar experts, projects and programs, funding sources, northern communities themselves, a calendar of polar events. We started populating it with Canadian information. We're now internationalizing it to bring as much information as we can from the rest of the northern and southern polar areas. And you've got it literally in the palm of your hand. And we're looking always to gather more information, learn about more experts in projects and programs. One of our concrete, tangible deliverables that our Prime Minister, the Honourable Stephen Harper, is very proud of is the soon-to-be-built Canadian High Arctic Research Station that will happen at Cambridge Bay, a community of 1,700 people, 1,700. There will be 35 to 40 new scientists attached to this thing, so that's significant population growth in Cambridge Bay. It'll be funky and modern. It'll take into account a lot of traditional Inuit values in terms of how it's designed and laid out. Some artist renditions. Materials are being shipped this coming summer. It'll be about a 3-year build to open in 2017. Never mind the details of the floor plan. Look at the colors. The reds and browns across the top are sort of the lab areas and various technical things. Green are the sort of the office areas for the staff. And all of the blue areas are designed for interaction, to bring communities members in so that they can hands-on and learn about how you check for contaminants in a fish or a seal, things that are relevant to the Inuit. We really want to reach out and integrate this scientific facility as much as we can with the local population. And that's quite in contrast to other Arctic things where they're absolutely remote, and it's just great that it's that way. Well, we're in a different era, and because we want engagement and capacity building, we really designed this place to be as interactive as it possibly can. In terms of logistics to support field work, we have a world-class facility at Resolute Bay, which is at 78.5 degrees north in the middle of the Arctic islands of Canada, where we dispatch Twin Otter aircraft and helicopters in support of scientific research of all shapes and sizes. In addition to this main hub at Resolute Bay, there's a distributed network of over 50 individual research stations at various other parts in the Canadian Arctic, and you can find out more about that on our website, polarcom.gc.ca. Supporting the work of scientists to solve the key questions that are still puzzling us about the Arctic and keying that into a global situation and increasingly involving the local people in that so that we get the traditional knowledge as well as the Western science knowledge, because all ways of knowing are important, and particularly when you're dealing with a relatively short Western science history of things, tapping into the knowledge of the Inuit elders and their inherited knowledge from the previous generations is really a valuable long-term timescale to assess what's happening with respect to environmental change. We have a lovely design now for the John G. Diefenbaker, which will be our new heavy icebreaker. We haven't started cutting steel yet, but this will be our new flagship vessel. Our existing one, the Louis Saint Laurent, a little bit smaller than this, and it's 40 plus years old, and it's on its second refit, and it's due to be replaced. This is one of our pieces of the sovereignty agenda. It's an unarmed vessel. All of our Coast Guard vessels are. Primary focus is search and rescue, breaking ice for navigation, and waving the flag, frankly. But these are unarmed vessels. This is not a defense mechanism at all. So the Diefenbaker hopefully will be in the water in 3.5 years' time. Canada has long had a strength in airborne radar sensing for all sorts of purposes, from security to resource exploration to ice management. RadarSat-1 has come and gone. We're on RadarSat-2, and the mission that's just been funded for completion in about 2 years' time is the RadarSat-3 constellation, and it will be 3 smaller satellite spacecraft working in succession so we can have some near real-time change detection. The first satellite may find something of interest. You can task the third, the second one picks it up, and you can actually see differences over the course of hours instead of the course of days when the repeat cycle goes through. So that's another way that we're keeping an eye on things, as well as supporting environmental and economic activities. On the subject of hydrocarbons, our Alaska resources happen to sit in the easternmost part of the Beaufort Sea. On the main map here, the western edge of that is the border between the Yukon Territory and Alaska, so the geology is the same. The wildlife come and go across the boundary, and regardless of where you want to put the boundary, the resources, the pollution, the animals, the people come and go as they please. In pink are discovery licenses, where in the 1970s and 80s, significant exploration activity happened in the shallow waters of the Beaufort, and huge resources of oil and gas were discovered. The brownish-colored polygons are current exploration licenses. So there's still an interest. There is no active drilling at this point, but a couple of the major international companies are starting to ramp up their seismic exploration programs so they can start to target within their exploration licenses. So it's relatively dormant at this point, in contrast to the other side of the boundary. And the big difference is the Trans-Alaska Pipeline that for decades has allowed Alaskan North Slope oil to move to the southern side of the state for transport to markets. All of these hydrocarbon resources in northern Canada right now are isolated. They're going nowhere anytime soon. The Mackenzie Valley pipeline that was to run down the Mackenzie Valley, the Mackenzie River itself to connect to the northern part of Alaska, northern part of Alberta, where the rest of our gas distribution system is, has been on the books and has had a couple of goes, and more about a year and a half ago was approved right at the time when gas prices hit rock bottom and shale gas came on stream. So if you're an economist, you can probably safely conclude that the hydrocarbon resources in this part of the world are staying where they are for the short term at least. Oil may be a different story. That can be transported by ice-breaking vessel. Liquefied natural gas is another option that's being considered. Time will tell, and it's really all about economics. The geology is under control. The resources have been discovered. Additional resources are going to be discovered. It's all about economics at this point. So knowledge to action. That's what our organization, the Polar Commission, is all about. Gathering and analyzing the appropriate information, making some sense out of it so it can be used. We do this through things like the International Polar Year Wrap-Up Conference that took place 2 years ago in Montreal. We also look at knowledge to action at the pointy end of things where an Inuit hunter needs to know what's going on to go after a whale or a seal or fish to feed his family. So again, it's Western science knowledge as well as traditional knowledge, and it's about bringing it together and making sense of it. And certainly under our current land claims, the local decision-making power is becoming increasingly important. And the people who have survived in these extreme environments for millennia are the ones now more involved in making the decision and using their traditional knowledge and working with those with Western science knowledge. So it's those combinations of Western and traditional about the environment, about energy, that leads to the best possible informed, sustainable development. The Inuit want to move ahead as well. They're moving into the wage economy. They like to heat their homes with oil. They don't like to freeze. They like to eat southern food as well as country food. They like to ride around on snowmobiles that require hydrocarbons to move them to their favorite hunting spot. They're the consummate adapters. When something better comes along, they get with the program. But they have the traditional knowledge, the traditional ways. These activities are culturally important as well as nutritionally important to feeding your family with high-quality, nutritious food, as well as doing what's been done since time immemorial. So it's important in many ways. These are a couple of historic shots of drilling activities. These are springtime shots, so the weather's nice and warm. It's worse and cold and dark in the winter. Pretty much leave it at there, and we can look forward to a bit of a discussion. But I thought we'd throw that out to just put a bit of a Canadian context on the table for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was great. I'm delighted to be able to introduce Michael Bromwich, who is the founder and managing principal of the Bromwich Group, which offers crisis management and strategic advisory services, as well as more specialized services on offshore energy. Michael Bromwich has really had a remarkable career. Over 30 years, he's been a federal prosecutor, a special prosecutor, an inspector general, a lawyer in private practice, and then most recently, for those of you who follow these issues, the United States top offshore drilling regulator. He was selected in June 2010 by President Obama to reform the regulation and oversight of offshore drilling in our country in the wake of the Deepwater Horizon accident. And in that capacity led the development and implementation of a series of far-reaching regulatory and organizational reforms, and won plaudits and gratitude from a lot of people for doing that. He served as director of the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management Regulation. He has 3 Harvard degrees. As you can tell, he overcame that handicap and went on to a successful career. Delighted to have Michael Bromwich with us.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Centre for sponsoring this and the Consulate General of Canada for supporting it. These are really important and key issues for all of us, so I'm delighted to be able to share some thoughts with you about that. My thoughts are more personal, and I want to walk you through a little bit of how I was first exposed to these Arctic issues, because I don't have a science background, nor did I know very much at all about Arctic issues before I took the job with the administration in June of 2010. And I really backed into the complicated Arctic-related development and environmental issues because I was brought in not to deal with the Arctic. I was brought in to deal with the Gulf of Mexico and the ongoing oil spill that started in April of 2010. And as I'm sure many of you watched day by day, sickeningly on CNN, the oil continued to flow into the Gulf of Mexico until it was capped in the middle of July. So when I got to the Department of the Interior in June of 2010, the Arctic was not job one or issue one, far from it. We were dealing with the continuing crisis caused by the Macondo oil spill and worried about both stopping the oil spill and figuring out what we as a U.S. government needed to do next. I don't know whether many of you recall it. It's now almost 4 years, but it was really an existential moment for all of offshore drilling. I think many of the major companies and some of the not-so-major companies thought that that might be it, that an oil spill of that magnitude with so much damage and so visible to the world might really spell the end of offshore development. Our first task really was then to figure out how to responsibly begin activities again, if it could be done responsibly. And so even before Alaska and the Arctic were on my screen, we had to figure out the different issues that we had to address to try to make a regime work that clearly hadn't worked. So we worked through a range of issues, initially pointing really at the Gulf of Mexico, but it turned out that they were extremely relevant to the Arctic as well. And the three issues were really prevention, containment, and spill response. Now, on prevention, clearly the U.S. regulations had not been supple enough, dynamic enough, or tough enough to lower the risks of a catastrophic accident like Deepwater Horizon. So we immediately got to work on that, and we put together some really new, tough, demanding, but appropriate drilling safety regulations, largely technical, that drove change in terms of what industry, what companies had to do in order to qualify to get their permits to drill. So we had new drilling safety regulations. We also, U.S., as you probably know, has a regulatory model that is largely prescriptive. That is, it sets out specific rules, things that you do, things that you don't do. The regulatory model in much of the rest of the world is what's called performance-based. That is, there are general standards and principles. And then in many cases, you turn over to private companies the job of assessing the risks that are faced by engaging in various kinds of activities. So the governmental role is different under a performance-based regime. Canada changed its regime largely from a prescriptive to a performance-based system in about 2009. Many other countries preceded that. Australia has done it. The UK has done it, and Norway was actually the first to have done it. And one of the pressures that we faced was many people were saying you need to go to a performance-based model because a prescriptive model inevitably becomes a checklist model where people are just checking the box and regulators are not holistically looking at whether the operation is going to work and can be done safely. So we did put out a new performance-based rule called the Safety and Environmental Management System that now requires operators everywhere, the Gulf of Mexico and in the Arctic, to do this kind of risk analysis, this change management analysis, all sorts of exercises that companies in the U.S. Had never had to do. So that was prevention. Now, containment was the obvious flaw in the United States' regulatory armament. We did not know how to deal with a subsea spill. Neither did industry, nor did anyone have the equipment. And we saw what happened when that was the case. And so we determined in the U.S. government generally, but also in the Department of the Interior specifically, that we had to make sure that we were prepared, that we had the mechanisms, the systems, the equipment in place to contain a subsea blowout. And industry recognized right away that if they didn't come up with a containment system or set of systems, they weren't going to be allowed to drill in deep water anymore. So very quickly they formed two consortia. The majors formed something called the MWCC, the Marine Well Containment Company, and then there was another consortium called Helix, led by a company based in Houston called Helix. And so what we determined in the fall of 2010 is that no company, no operator would be permitted to drill in deep water without having entered into contracts that showed that they could contain a subsea blowout if one were to occur. So that was the containment issue, which becomes quite relevant to the Arctic. And then the third was spill response. And I think one of the striking things that people discovered as they went through Macondo and Deepwater Horizon was that spill response technology had improved almost not at all in 25 years since the Exxon Valdez. You had the same equipment, you had the same kinds of ships, you had the same boom. It was remarkable, frankly, how little technology had advanced in terms of spill response. And regrettably, that remains true today. One of the facilities that the Department of the Interior manages is a spill response test facility in Omset, New Jersey, not far from here. And I visited there within a year of my taking the job at Interior. And one of the stunning things I learned was that almost none of the major oil companies tested spill response there. They had lots of vacant spaces on their calendar when nobody was using it. And so to me, the big question was why? And so I wrote a letter to all the CEOs of the major oil companies basically saying, why aren't you using this facility? Are you not serious about figuring out better ways of responding to a spill? Suffice it to say, I didn't get very satisfactory answers, and still, as we stand here and sit here in 2014, we are not where we need to be in terms of spill response. So the Gulf of Mexico issues for me were obviously front and center, but it really didn't take very long for Arctic issues, for Alaska issues to come to the fore for me. In fact, within a month of my being on the job, in July of 2010, a court decision that ruled that my agency's environmental analysis was insufficient was handed down by the court, which stopped things in their tracks. And what I quickly became familiar with was that that was a fact of life, that in fact, attempts to explore in the Arctic, in the U.S. Arctic, were constantly tied up in lawsuits. Companies were trying to go forward with development activities, and a set of environmental organizations did their very best to use the legal system to stop that and stop it for good. They have met over time with mixed success, but enough success to stop development at various points along the way. Now, the court's decision in July of 2010 most directly affected Shell. And as any of you who have followed energy development in the Arctic over the last few years in the U.S. Arctic know, Shell has been the major player there. And they've been the major player because they spent over $2 billion in 2008 to purchase a series of leases, large acreage, which they thought were very promising in terms of oil and gas development, particularly oil development. Now, one of the things I learned was that Shell had been quite savvy in their activities in Alaska. They knew that at the outset they faced strong opposition from local groups, the Inuits, throughout Alaska. And they put substantial time, energy, effort, and money into meeting with the local peoples, finding out what were the issues of greatest concern to the local peoples, and making a series of concessions and pledges and promises about how they would go about doing their energy development work in ways that would benefit the communities. And over time, they made enormous progress with the local communities. There's one legendary mayor, Edward Itta, of the North Slope Borough, who rode to office really in part on strong opposition to energy development by Shell or by any other oil company. But through a series of discussions over a number of years, and through a series of demands that Mayor Itta and others made of Shell, Shell met those demands. And by the time that I was in the government in 2010, Mayor Itta was a cautious supporter of Shell's limited program for developing oil and gas offshore in the Arctic. When we were talking to Shell in the summer and fall of 2010, what they wanted above all with the deepwater drilling moratorium that we put in place, the new regulations that we were rolling out that was creating uncertainty within the industry, they wanted clarity as to whether all of that was going to allow them to go forward, because at that time they hoped to go forward and drill in both the Chukchi Sea and the Beaufort Sea in the summer of 2011. Well, there was so much turmoil and so much uncertainty that they fairly quickly came to understand that that was a non-starter. And in fact, what they needed to do was to submit new environmental assessments that took into account what we had just experienced in the Gulf of Mexico, and that they really did an analysis of the specific kinds of environmental challenges that would exist in the Beaufort and the Chukchi Sea. Some of you may remember that the environmental analysis that had been done in connection with the BP well in the Gulf of Mexico was a joke. It was cut and pasted from other environmental analysis and assessments. It talked about walruses and other species that were native to the Arctic occurring in the Gulf of Mexico when that had never been seen before. And what that did was to cast a harsh light on how perfunctory these environmental analyses had been in many cases. And so we really felt we had no choice but to make this a real exercise and not a pretend one. One of the things I was asked to do by Secretary Salazar within a month of my getting to Interior was to go out and find out about what people's attitudes and views were on offshore drilling. And so we held a series of 8 public forums really throughout the country, the parts of the country where there is offshore drilling. So primarily in the Gulf of Mexico, we did one also in California, but we also did one in Alaska. And that trip to Alaska in August of 2010 was my first deep dive into all the interesting forces and dynamics that surround the large question of should offshore resources be developed or not? What's the appropriate balance between economic development, environmental protection, sustaining the lives of the natives there, and so on. So we held a forum in Anchorage in late August of 2010, and just to demonstrate how critical the issue is to people up there, both United States senators attended, Mayor of Anchorage attended, the governor of Alaska was scheduled to attend but had to pull out at the last minute, and many other high-level political officials appeared. And that drove home to me how critical the energy resource, energy development, environmental protection equation has been and continues to be for people in Alaska. And I really saw firsthand the difficulty of navigating between the needs on the one hand to develop the resource and on the other hand to protect a way of life and to protect the environment. And I was fortunate during that trip to go up to the North Slope, to go up to Barrow, and to fly around in a charter plane and visit a number of local communities on the North Slope. And it was amazing to me the diversity of views that I saw. We went to one village called Wainwright, and people were very concerned about the prospects of Shell or any other company developing offshore resources, very concerned about it. We took a 20-minute flight to another village that was so destitute, that was so in need of jobs and money being infused into the economy, that they were strong supporters of development. I sat down in a cafeteria with the mayor, and he explained why developing the offshore resource was, he thought, vital to any kind of meaningful continuation of life in that village. So just literally 2 hours apart, 20 miles apart, totally different views among some of the Inuits about whether to go forward or not. No development went forward in 2011, and I left the government at the end of 2011. But because of the interest that had been sparked through the trip to Barrow, through wrestling with some of these Arctic development issues, I've obviously followed the issue very closely, and I'm sure many of you have as well. So Shell continued to move forward. It submitted the new environmental analyses in 2011. We approved one for the Beaufort in August of 2011, one for the Chukchi in December of 2011. And for those of you who are not familiar with sort of the details of this, there is a 5-year plan, then there's a lease sale, then there is an exploration plan that companies that own a lease must submit that should contain detailed environmental analysis. And the final step is an application to drill that falls within the umbrella of the exploration plan. And so what we made Shell do was go back to the drawing board, submit new environmental assessments, environmental reviews, which they did in 2011, and they were looking forward to being able to drill a limited number of wells in the Chukchi Sea and the Beaufort Sea in 2012. I think many of you know what happened. It finally looked like the stars were aligning for Shell, and then Murphy's Law took over in an enormous way. One of the rigs, it had two rigs up there, one was going to be in each of the seas, and the other was going to serve as potentially being available to drill a relief well in case something bad happened in the other sea. Well, one of the rigs slipped off its moorings and almost ran aground even before it got to first base. The spill response barge that Shell had chartered failed to pass certification, and it just didn't fail in one respect. It failed in many respects. Certification by the Coast Guard. The containment equipment that the agency had required Shell to develop, even though the wells in both the Beaufort and the Chukchi were shallow water, and even though we had only required containment in the Gulf of Mexico for deep water, in recognition of the sensitivity of the environment in the Arctic, we insisted that Shell develop a containment capability. And the containment equipment was badly damaged during a test. One unfortunate email that an agency member wrote said it crumpled like a beer can, which is not what you want to see and what you had hoped would be a robust containment device. At the end, Shell obtained permission not to go into hydrocarbon-bearing zones where you run into real complications potentially and issues, but do just some top hole drilling to do some preliminary work that they might be able to return to later on. They drilled for 1 day before an enormous ice flow came their way and forced them to have to clear out for a number of days. So, and then following that, as if that weren't bad enough, months later, as it was being towed to a port in Seattle for repairs, the second drilling rig ran aground in Kodiak Island. A couple of months later, the EPA issued multiple citations saying that both rigs had violated environmental regulations during the very brief time that they'd been operating in the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas. So if you ever wanted an example of an event, an activity where everything went wrong, this was that event. The government really had no choice but to commission an internal review, which it did, which the essence of it was, what the hell went wrong? Why did something where so much money was invested, where there should have been so much planning over a long period of time, how could things have gone so badly in a number of realms? And that report, which was published in the spring of 2013, its ultimate conclusion was, quote, Shell entered into the drilling season not fully prepared in testing certain critical systems and establishing the scope of its operational plans. And so it established a set of requirements for allowing Shell to drill again. One was a need for a comprehensive and integrated operational plan, and the second was a reviewed third-party management system, which needed to be audited by an outsider. So these very public and embarrassing failures of Shell's in 2012 really served as yet another wake-up call to Shell, to the industry, and to the administration. Everyone had known the challenges of drilling in the Arctic would be great, but these showed that the challenges were even greater than people had anticipated. Shell was then again looking this summer in anticipation of continuing work in both the Beaufort and the Chukchi. And in January of this year, just 2 months ago, an appellate court decision in California invalidated the underlying lease sale under which Shell was proceeding and said that the Interior Department had not done a sufficiently robust environmental analysis, that the numbers that they came up with for the amount of energy that would be produced were arbitrary and capricious, and so that sent things back to the drawing board. Now, I think it's fair to say that it was an open question, given all the problems that Shell faced in 2012, whether it was going to be prepared to go forward in 2014. Not surprisingly, within a month or so after the court decision, Shell announced that it would not go forward in 2014. And it is not clear, as we sit here today, whether they will go forward in 2015 or not. Shell has suffered some financial reverses. They are pulling back on some of their investments in various parts of the world. And I don't think anybody can fairly describe what's gone on for them in Alaska as anything other than a disappointment so far. Now, this set of issues is still a very live set of issues, even though Shell has put its plans on the shelf for a while, and even though there are no players ready to step up. There were companies who bought leases in 2008. ConocoPhillips bought leases, BP bought leases, and they have followed with great interest and not been encouraged by what has happened to Shell. And so as we sit here today, there are no current plans for any drilling, exploratory drilling in the U.S. Arctic this year or next year. Now, the twists and turns that I've just described to you shouldn't obscure the fact that this is an enduring conundrum. The story is not over. There's just too many resources there, and they're just too attractive. David was talking about the estimates of resources. Just in terms of sort of U.S. planning, it's an enormous percentage of what might be technically recoverable in the U.S. And so I don't think anyone can conclude that companies or the government are going to give up at this point. But there are unique challenges that exist in the Arctic, far more than in the Gulf of Mexico, far more than most of the venues in the world where offshore drilling takes place. You have, as David mentioned, extreme weather conditions, which dramatically shortens the period during which any drilling can even conceivably take place. You have extraordinarily delicate ecosystems where very many species uniquely exist in the Arctic. A huge percentage of the world's polar bears, for example, live in the Arctic. A huge percentage of the U.S.'s polar bear population lives in the Arctic. And so this will be a story that will not have disappeared even in the U.S. At all. And part of the reason for that is, as David alluded to, just as we frequently talk about one Gulf in terms of the Gulf of Mexico, it's one Arctic. And even though Shell may not go forward, that doesn't mean other countries are not going forward, and they are. So the U.S., less so now, obviously, but Canada, Russia, Norway, Denmark, Greenland, Iceland are all very interested and continue to be interested in developing offshore resources. And as David mentioned, the Arctic Council has been established in recognition of the common interests that really should bind together the countries that are and that constitute the Arctic. And that, if utilized to its maximum, the Arctic Council and its affiliated entities should serve as a continuing forum for collaboration and cooperation among Arctic nations. Although there are not going to be any further lease sales in the U.S. Arctic until 2015 and 2016, things aren't standing still. As I'm sure many of you know, Russia has moved forward and is announced in December that it is already producing from offshore in the Arctic. Now, on a relatively small scale, on a relatively unchallenging part of the environment in the context of the Arctic. But they are moving forward, and I think we can expect that they will continue to move forward. So despite differences in regulatory regimes and very pronounced new tensions that infect the relationship among Arctic Council nations, there is going to be a dramatic and urgent need to continue to coordinate, cooperate, communicate, and to have transparent approaches to the three issues that, whether we're talking about the Gulf of Mexico or we're talking about the Arctic, are going to need to continue to be focused on. And those are prevention, containment, and spill response. Those are the set of issues on which continued discussions are and will remain vital. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Two very interesting presentations. Thank you. I have a few questions, and then anybody who wants to ask a question, please come up here and identify yourself. I actually want to start with a very basic question for David, which is, does a melting Arctic make exploring for hydrocarbons easier or harder or both? Because on the one hand, it presumably melts ice, which is hard to get through. On the other hand, it creates a more dynamic environment, which is threatening. And so from a scientific perspective, easier, harder, or both? And
Yeah, the answer is both. In some ways, it's making surface transportation a little bit easier, as the open water season is a little bit longer. But in the onshore regime, where much of the infrastructure is built on the concept that the ground is permanently frozen, that in permafrost is changing. So lots of things are destabilizing at the same time as things are opening up. So it's not as easy as, wow, there's less ice, let's go. The ice that remains is less predictable. There's big pieces of it that are tougher to spot, and they'll still take your ship out. So even though there's open water, it's not easy. It'll probably never be easy, but it's not a simple answer. So you're on track there.
And let me ask a question. I'm not sure that either of you have the information to answer this, but I was wondering, as you were talking about the economics of oil and gas drilling up there, and oil's up over $100 a barrel, what is there a received wisdom in the industry about how much it costs to drill in the Arctic, what oil price is needed, or what gas price is needed for that matter, if either of you know?
So I mean, first of all, it's all driven by demand. So, because there's a constant demand for more, that's why people are even thinking about it. I suspect each one of the companies has an economic model that allows them to figure out what they think the price will be 15 years down the road, when what they might find today might actually come into production. So there's some modeling in behind that. And that would obviously be fraught with uncertainties, like a game changer, such as the fracking revolution and what that's done to both oil and gas. Cost, and when it comes to the Arctic, you don't just bring another rig over, pull off one and move it over, and the next day it starts on the next site. You've got to bring it in from somewhere, some other part of the world. You've got to winterize it. These things cost $500,000 a day or more just to have under contract, even while it's sailing to your job site. Equipment fails in the extreme temperatures there. You've got to have a backup of everything, because you're not in the Gulf where, well, the supplier's right around the corner. Just bring another one in. You don't have anything on standby because there's existing infrastructure. You're pioneering. You're out there all by yourself. I can't quantify it, but those are some of the challenges. You're really out there all by yourself, and certainly Shell found that. And I remember seeing the map on their website. Here's the vessels and here's the aircraft. This is what we're bringing to bear, and it's a drop in the bucket compared to what's in the Gulf. And is it enough or not? Well, that's another thing. So the costs are huge. It's much more independent, and you're always in a more extreme, harsh environment. Can be done. It's happening in some parts of the world, but I can't quote specifically what target price per barrel they need as a go, no-go on that.
And what makes that so incredibly difficult is the long time horizon that companies face in developing the resource. So even if you've got great models, I mean, the price of oil and gas is so variable over time. It would be different if what you were looking at is, okay, the oil price is this now, so if I bring the resource on within a year, chances are it'll stay roughly at that level. These projects take 10 years to develop. And so one of the things I learned many things, but one of the things that was most surprising is the enormous risk and gambles that have to be taken by these major oil companies, because the number of dry holes dramatically exceeds the number of hits. And as David said, they are enormous. The whole operation is enormously costly. As he said, the price of renting a rig, he actually gave you the low estimate. It's between $500,000 and $1 million a day. And so the overall cost for a company of drilling an exploration well are enormous. They're in the tens of millions of dollars. And you just think about the economics. If a high percentage of those ventures fail, you've really got to get lucky on the ones that hit. And you've got to hope that oil prices are at a level that will mean a profit for you. So I didn't appreciate what the enormous financial stakes involved in drilling these wells and the high percentage of failure.
Michael, could you elaborate on containment in the Arctic and what's required there? And any of us who lived through Deepwater Horizon, as you pointed to in your remarks, are very focused on containment. Do we have the capability to contain a spill in the Arctic? And did the Shell permitting process proceed to the point where the U.S. government had approved a Shell containment plan or not?
As I recall it, they had provisionally. They wanted to see these additional tests, and that's when it failed. And so they did not get to the point. It was would have been part of the final application for a drilling permit process, and it never fully got to that because, as I said, only top hole drilling was permitted. And what containment is much more challenging in deep water, obviously, because the blowouts are going to happen much farther beneath the surface of the ocean than they will in a place like Alaska. So the challenges are different. The type of equipment was somewhat different. And as I said, containment is not required in shallow water in the Gulf of Mexico. Because of the special sensitivities in the ecosystems in Alaska, people in the agency felt very strongly that we should have a containment requirement in the Arctic, and I think you will continue to find that as a requirement.
How deep does the water get in the Arctic, David?
So far, the work in the Beaufort has been in the tens to hundreds of meters. So anything more than a couple hundred meters is what we're starting to call the deeper part, and the abyssal plain is a couple thousand meters deep. So
A couple thousand meters deep?
More than a mile deep.
Ah.
Yeah, so there's no permits out there yet, and they literally walked off the dry land into the shallow offshore, and that's where the discoveries of the 70s and 80s were made, in up to 10 to 20 meters of water, so 100 feet max for the current round.
The Shell wells, as I recall, were in less than 100 feet of water, both in the Beaufort and the Chukchi. They certainly, the Macondo well was 5,000 feet, so totally different.
Just my last question before anybody who wants to come up can ask a question. Just wonder if either of you could elaborate on what's happening in countries other than Canada and the United States. You mentioned this briefly, Michael, at the end of your remarks. There's something happening in Russia. It's obviously of interest given what's in the news. Any information on Russian plans or the other countries?
Well, not so much detail on future plans, but certainly the Russians have been exploring and producing in their onshore Arctic for decades. And frankly, that's where a lot of their oil that allows them to play the economic, political game that they're currently underway, that's where that comes from. They are stepping out into the shallow offshore. They have had some success. They too are demonstrating, like the Norwegians, it can be done. However, again, most of their current production is from onshore conventional resources. And, I think there's economics and there's economics. In the West, we look very much at the pure private sector free market economy, and at the end of the day, the shareholder demands a certain return on investment. In other countries around the world, particularly where there are state-owned enterprises doing the exploration and production, that market business doesn't really count for quite as much. It's more important to have the resource to be able to exert your policy decisions, never mind what the market has to say. And I think Russia's in that situation now in terms of being able to be a big exporter. That of course brings revenues from foreign currency into your country, and that's very important to them. So that's there's economics and there's economics.
Yeah, I don't know the details of what the Russian plans are, but at a couple of meetings of the International Regulators Forum, I met and spoke with some of the Russians, and they seem very determined to explore the offshore resource, and we've seen already that they've done it.
Well, and I'd add to that the Russians are working increasingly in partnership with Western free market, non-state-owned companies. So they're working with Shell, they're working with Conoco, they're working with Exxon, so that the extra accountability will come with that, because Exxon shareholders will demand that even when you're drilling with the Russians, we expect you to stay off the front page of the newspaper for some environmental nightmare. So the shareholder, that triple bottom line, will increasingly apply in other parts of the world where international players who trade on the markets are involved.
Thank you for coming. If you identify yourself.
Bob Harris, beyond the 200-mile exclusive economic zone, that would be open to any country. But I mean, theoretically, no country would, be involved in, doing any development or exploration. Is that correct? And the other question is about you mentioned the unarmed Coast Guard. Is there any other military activity going on? Submarines aren't part of the Coast Guard, are they?
That's correct, they're not. No.
Oh,
No,
so
I can comment.
So, yeah, if you could elaborate a little bit more on, military exercises or surveillance and things like that.
So right now in Canada, we have a relatively small coastal navy. None of it is prepared to work in ice-infested waters. As I say, none of it is ice-strengthened. In the summer, we have had exercises where conventional non-ice strengthened naval vessels venture into the Arctic in the open water season, accompanied by icebreakers just in case. So we do not have armed icebreaking capacity in Canada, period. And so if you could refresh my memory on the first one.
So who does that? The United States?
Oh, no, the situation in the U.S. is even worse.
Yeah.
We have fewer and older icebreaking vessels in our Coast Guard. There really is, as I recall, one icebreaker currently in service that should have been retired 20 years ago and has been brought back into service multiple times. So it is a scandal that the U.S. Has such a shortage of icebreaking vessels that the Coast Guard has been asking for them for many, many years, just hasn't gotten them.
Yeah. Canada has 4 submarines. They're conventional diesel-electric. We got a good deal on them from our friends in the UK, and we're still trying to get all of them into service. They have zero capability in ice-covered waters, so we have no capacity there.
In response to your first question, I don't know of any proposed or projected activities that go beyond the 200-mile EEZs. I don't know if you do or not.
But that area would be open to any other country, other than the Nordic or Russia or the United States, Canada.
So I'm not aware of any activity in those zones either, but there is a process through the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea whereby coastal states can extend their exclusive economic zone beyond 200 nautical miles out to 350 if they can demonstrate that those areas beyond 200 nautical miles are natural prolongations of their continental landmass.
I see.
And there's a bunch of geological criteria and bathymetric criteria that allow a country to gather data in their offshore region and then make a case to the Commission on the Law of the Sea that there should be a prolongation of economic rights, not territorial rights. The extending beyond 200 doesn't make it part of your country, but it can give you economic rights to the resources on and below the seafloor. And Canada has just completed basically a 10-year effort to gather data off its east coast and, to a limited extent, the west coast, and in the Canadian Arctic.
But that would require ratification by countries?
Absolutely, and there's a lineup at the Commission to get things done. So right now there's zero activity beyond 200 nautical miles because you can't demonstrate the economic ownership, if you will, or rights to those resources.
Now, as you probably know, in its infinite wisdom, the U.S. has never ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty. We have acceded to it.
They abide by it, though.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi there. Michael Diddick with a student here at CEPA and Columbia Business School. Just wondering, has there been conclusive studies done on the amount of associated gas with the oil resources? I know by comparison, in some of the deep water resources in Brazil and in the pre-salt, there's a substantial amount of gas there, and making the economics of drilling work is difficult because the environmental regulations are so strong there. That the gas has to be captured, can't be flared. So what is the estimate for what's there, and what's Canada's position on any associated gas?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of associated gas in the Arctic. I think it's become, because of the shale gas revolution in this country, it's become increasingly unattractive as a resource. Just the economics of it have made it far less attractive than it was even a couple of years ago, and far less attractive than oil continues to be. I have some numbers here which I'll look for, but it's a very significant volume of gas in the Arctic. David, I don't know if you have those figures.
No, I don't have figures either, but there's no shortage of natural gas out there. It's the economics of what would it cost you to discover, produce, and transport that gas to market.
It's actually 78 trillion cubic feet in the Chukchi of recoverable natural gas, and 28 trillion cubic feet, which is a lot in the Beaufort. So,
Yeah, and then if-
tremendous.
No, we're pretty strict on that as well. Yeah.
Marjorie Shaw, thank you so much for all these interesting events that Columbia SEPA has, which I'm very grateful for. You were centering on the Arctic, but there also is discussion with climate change and global warming of the melting of the ice and the rising of the sea levels and the important cities that are on the coastlines. And I'm wondering if you're figuring in the externalities of the costs that rising seas might have on the huge metropolitan areas that could be affected and the countries by the rising oceans.
Yeah, well, that's a good question, and there's certainly a number of models out there that show that inevitably, I mean, and it's not the melting of the winter-summer sea ice, it's the melting of the onshore dry land ice caps like Greenland, and most importantly, Antarctica, because, I don't know, 80% of the above sea ice is in Antarctica, say another 15 or so percent is in Greenland, and the rest of it's in small ice caps in various other places. So, you know, as a geologist, I know that sea level has been higher and lower in the past. And it hasn't much mattered, except now we've got all this built infrastructure that's within a couple of meters of sea level. So now it matters. And there's infrastructure in the subways below the sea level. I'm not sure that, you know, the full cost implication of what would it, even for New York City, what would it matter to New York City if the sea level was 1 or 2 meters higher? What would be how would you mitigate against that? And then the stormwater slopping over. I mean, astronomical is what comes to mind immediately, but I'm not aware of any, you know, personally aware of any hard calculations. There may well be some out there.
That's a big topic that got a lot of conversation with Superstorm Sandy. So
Absolutely, yeah.
Thank you for your words about the events that we've been holding here. I want to particularly thank Ka Wei, who's in the back of the room, who's done an enormous amount on this, and Don is over here. Thank you guys for pulling this together. This is part of a series of events that we've run with everybody from Energy Secretary Ernie Moniz to General Stanley McChrystal to a number of other distinguished speakers. So we're delighted to be able to do this. If you aren't on our mailing list and want to be, let us know. And you can go to energypolicy.columbia.edu. Is that right, Kat? Energypolicy.columbia.edu is our website to learn more about the coming events. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Tom Weissmuller. I'm interested in the future infrastructure that the federal governments of each of the respective countries is putting up there. The Russians have nuclear-powered icebreakers that routinely punch their way to the North Pole. As you correctly stated, we have one icebreaker that's just been recently retrofitted, successful sea trials, but just one. And the Canadians have 4. Is there a 5-year plan for augmenting the infrastructure in the northern seas that would maybe able to help a company, an oil company that might be in trouble if in fact there is a spill or other damage? Because right now I think those resources really aren't there.
That's one of the dramatic weaknesses that we have is the lack of adequate infrastructure. I think that's why many people were concerned about the idea of drilling in the Arctic. And even those of us in government who were prepared to let it go forward at a modest level. I think the episode with Shell really brought home how fraught with danger, given the current state of our infrastructure, significant amounts of offshore drilling would be. So I think the pendulum has shifted. Because of what we've seen over the last few years, I think there is more concern about the lack of infrastructure, which may drive decisions on drilling applications. I haven't yet seen a real plan to develop the infrastructure that would be necessary in order for us to more comfortably support it. So we'll just have to. It's a significant part of it is the Coast Guard's budget. Not all of it, but a significant part of it, yes.
And it's a similar situation in Canada, that the communities are really underserved by infrastructure. In Nunavut, 25 of the 26 communities are coastal. The Inuit are coastal people. There are 2 or 3 small craft harbors that are, provide reasonable shelter for small fishing vessels. There are no deep water ports. There was one at, there were 2. There's one at the Nanisivik zinc mine on northern Baffin Island, and there was one at the Polaris zinc mine on Little Cornwallis Island, both of which were dismantled when the companies decommissioned the mines at the end of the mine life. The Canadian government made a commitment to recreate a deep water naval facility at the Nanisivik mine site. It's become a deep water refueling facility, and it doesn't exist yet. They're still doing the environmental remediation from previous fuel storage there. So woefully inadequate. Search and rescue is the big issue for Northerners themselves. When somebody goes missing and you call for help, a Herc gets scrambled from somewhere in southern Ontario and it takes 4 or 5 hours to get there, just to get on site. There's limited local capacity. In the summertime, it's better when there are helicopters locally supporting mineral exploration onshore. You can rearrange one and get that out there. But it's inadequate, and it's something Northerners constantly pound the table for.
There's a broad recognition that there's an absence of sufficient infrastructure, and so there are a variety of proposals that have been made, including by the 2 senators from Alaska, who are very aware that there is a need for more infrastructure. But so far as I know, none of those proposals has gone anywhere yet, and certainly there are no major, there's no groundbreaking on a deep water port, for example, that I've heard anything about. So I think we're still very far behind where we need to be.
I don't know much about the specific budget requests here, but I know something about the overall federal budget situation. And I think one of the challenges here is that a lot of this spending is anticipated to come through the U.S. federal government, and the federal government's now living through an era of sequestration. I think in 3 out of the last 4 years, there hasn't even been a budget that's passed through Congress. So when the funding is anticipated to come through U.S. federal government, it's extremely problematic to have any new spending initiatives right now. John.
The comment was made, I believe, by Michael about the infrastructure. One of the things that we're doing is a year-round highway, which will go from Tuktoyaktuk, or Tuk for short, to Inuvik, and it'll be part of the Dempster Highway, which starts at Dawson Creek and Yukon, and goes to Inuvik, and then from Inuvik to Tuktoyaktuk. So that highway will be 85 miles. It will cost about $300 million. Launched this January, and it will provide year-round access. So hopefully that will be one of the key infrastructure pieces for social and economic development. But it's expensive. And, 85, I think it's 85 miles.
Yeah.
I know it in kilometers, so
Yeah.
it's about 137 kilometers.
Yeah, and it's called a highway, but it's a gravel road, a 2-lane, all-season gravel road. Yeah.
It's a year-round gravel road.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and which connects to another really long gravel road, the Dempster Highway, which, if you started from here and you had 3 weeks, you could drive to the Arctic Ocean once that thing's done. You can do it in the winter on the ice road that goes down the Mackenzie River and out onto the Beaufort. But to have year-round access to, and that, Canada does not have a road to its Arctic coast, period. Right?
Well, thank you both so much for joining us. Any final thoughts you'd move to share?
So I'll just, in closing, reinforce with a concrete example the ability of Inuit to control their own destiny. And I was marginally involved in this. 3 years ago, when I was still with the Geological Survey of Canada, we got ourselves into a partnership with a German state research organization, and their icebreaker, the Polarstern, which is a research vessel, we'd teed up a nice scientific cruise to try to figure out a little bit more about the geology of the Canadian side of Baffin Bay. And at the end of the day, the punchline was we had failed to consult properly and adequately with the Inuit per the terms and conditions of their land use permit. And at the end of the day, they said, that project can't go ahead. They were successful in getting a court injunction to say, we're not against the project, but we're against the way you did it. We were not adequately consulted. We have rights on that issue, and we were not, the boat was over the horizon when you were asking us questions about what we thought. That's not proper consultation. So under these modern land claims, there's an obligation to meaningfully consult and reasonably accommodate. Now, that same Inuit group is now that that lawsuit has been taken care of, they're open to development, but only if it's done in proper consultation with them, as the land claim states, and only if there's a net benefit for them. You know, they don't want all the risk in their backyard for some stakeholders or shareholders somewhere else to get the benefits. So the Inuit and other First Nations groups are appropriately using the terms of their modern land claims to exert the promises that were made to them by the federal government and signed off by our sovereign, the Queen, to make sure that they can control development. And they're going ahead where it makes sense, and they're saying no when it doesn't. So the Inuit themselves are not against, but they are against things that don't make sense. So they're using the provisions of their land claims as those land claims were intended to enable these guys. I'll close with that.
All the time we focus on issues that seem important or attractive, but turn out to be passing and not particularly permanent. This is not one of them. This issue, that is the appropriate balance between resource development, environmental protection, native rights, and the subsistence way of life, the balance among those factors is going to be an issue that will continue to occupy people through our lifetimes. There is just too many resources in the Arctic that are so valuable to so many people for this to be a passing issue. So your time here, I hope, was well spent, if it did nothing else than to focus you on an issue that will be an enduring one for the indefinite future.
Great note to end on. Please join me in giving our speakers a big hand.